The Quran that Muslims use today can supposedly be traced back to the Quran that was compiled by Zayd ibn Thabit during the reign of Uthman, the third of the so-called rightly guided caliphs. But we shouldn't forget that Zayd compiled the Quran twice, once during the caliphate of Abu Bakr, the first of the rightly guided caliphs, and later during the caliphate of Uthman. Interestingly, the two editions of the Quran compiled by Zayd ibn Thabit were not the same. They didn't have the same number of words. They didn't even have the same number of verses. Clearly, if the same man couldn't collect the same Quran twice, the perfectly preserved Quran is about as miraculous as this perfectly preserved human being. We're going to look at an example of how Zayd's first edition of the Quran was different from his second edition of the Quran. But before we go to the hadith, let's listen to Sheikh Yasir Qadhi as he explains the historical background.
In fact, what happened was, after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, the Quran was compiled within 2 years after his death. And so the official compilation took place when every single one of the major companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were still alive.
Abu Bakr convinced Zayd ibn Thabit to collect the Quran after much of the Quran was lost due to Muslims dying in battle. But the only purpose of this Quran was to preserve the Quran in case more Muslims died in battle.
But this official recension of the Quran was not made obligatory upon the entire caliphate, upon the entire Islamic nation. And people would simply copy with their own hands any copy that they had. And obviously human errors occurred. Obviously when you have 6th, 7th, 8th generation copyists, anybody at home who knows how to read and write is just copying the Quran, obviously errors are going to creep in, and there's no question that there were variances, spelling mistakes.
Hats off to Dr. Qadhi for admitting that there were textual variants among the early Quran manuscripts.
So you can imagine in a society that's very Bedouin in nature, very illiterate by and large, the religion is coming in, educating the people, you're going to get a lot of variations, and people began noticing this is just not right. But we have an official Quran, we have the official recension that was done by the first caliph. So the third caliph, Uthman, made a very simple decree, and he said, look, anybody who wants a copy of the Quran has to copy it directly from the master copy.
Which master copy? The master copy compiled during the caliphate of Abu Bakr, or a new master copy?
And to facilitate this, Uthman made a number of master copies from the original one. And he sent one master copy to every major city in the Islamic province. And this master copy was kept in the Grand Mosque of the city.
Notice, a number of master copies were produced from the original master copy. Dr. Qadhi makes it sound as if these were simply copies of the first Quran Zayd produced. As usual, however, Dr. Qadhi isn't giving us the whole story. But he's already admitted that Muslims had copies of the Quran with various mistakes, so what happened to those?
And from then on, anybody who wanted a Quran was free to go to the master copy and copy it directly from the original copy that was in the main mosque of the city. Therefore, when this was done, Uthman then said, anybody who has a private collection, anybody who has his own handwritten Quran that's 7th, 8th, 9th generation away, you need to dispose of it. And how is it disposed of? The way that you dispose of Qurans is you burn them.
So Abu Bakr decided to have Zayd ibn Thabit put together a master copy of the Quran. There was no obligation for other Muslims to follow this copy. Muslims made their own copies of the Quran, and since Muslims were making their own copies from memory or from copying someone else's copy, differences crept into the text. Uthman saw the problem, and he decided to make some copies of the master copy so that everyone's copies would match. And naturally, Uthman ordered Muslims to hand over their error-filled personal copies in order to completely standardize the text. That's the Sheikh Yasir Qadhi version of events. As is often the case when Muslim scholars explain the history of the Quran, however, there are holes in the narrative. Let's read a few passages from Sahih al-Bukhari, and we'll start to see the problem. Sahih al-Bukhari, 4679. Narrated Zayd bin Thabit al-Ansari, who was one of those who used to write the divine revelation, Abu Bakr sent for me after the heavy casualties among the warriors of the Battle of Yamama, where a great number of Qurra, those who know the Quran by heart, were killed. Umar was present with Abu Bakr, who said, Umar has come to me and said, the people have suffered heavy casualties on the day of the Battle of Yamama, and I am afraid that there will be more casualties among the Qur'an at other battlefields whereby a large part of the Quran may be lost unless you collect it. And I am of the opinion that you should collect the Quran. Abu Bakr added, I said to Umar, how can I do something which Allah's Messenger has not done? Umar said to me, by Allah, it is really a good thing. So Umar kept on pressing, trying to persuade me to accept his proposal till Allah opened my bosom for it, and I had the same opinion as Umar. Zayd bin Thabit added, Umar was sitting with him, Abu Bakr, and was quiet. Abu Bakr said to me, you are a wise young man, and we do not suspect you of telling lies or of forgetfulness, and you used to write the divine revelation for Allah's Messenger. Therefore look for the Quran and collect it in one manuscript. Look for the Quran? I thought they all knew it. By Allah, if he, Abu Bakr, had ordered me to shift one of the mountains from its place, it would not have been harder for me than what he had ordered me concerning the collection of the Quran. I said to both of them, how dare you do a thing which the Prophet has not done? Abu Bakr said, by Allah, it is really a good thing. So I kept on arguing with him about it till Allah opened my bosom for that which he had opened the bosoms of Abu Bakr and Umar. So I started to search. He had to search? I thought they all had it memorized. I started to search for the Quranic material and to collect it from parchments, scapula, leaf stalks of date palms, and from the memories of men who knew it by heart. I found with Khuzaymah 2 verses of Surat at-Tawbah which I had not found with anybody else, and they were, verily there has come unto you a messenger, Muhammad, from amongst yourselves, i.e. whom you know well. It grieves him that you should receive any injury or difficulty. He, Muhammad, is anxious over you to be rightly guided. Verse 9, 128. The manuscript on which the Quran was collected remained with Abu Bakr till Allah took him unto him, and then with Umar till Allah took him unto him, and finally it remained with Hafsa, Umar's daughter. Notice a few things from this passage. First, the reason Umar suggested collecting the Quran into a book was that the Muslims who had parts of the Quran memorized were dying in battle. Umar said, the people have suffered heavy casualties on the day of the Battle of Yamama, and I am afraid that there will be more casualties among the Qur'an at other battlefields whereby a large part of the Quran may be lost unless you collect it. Strange, didn't Allah promise that He would protect the Quran? This is actually a watered-down version of what happened. In reality, the only people who had certain passages of the Quran memorized died at the Battle of Yamama. We read in Ibn Abi Dawud's Kitab al-Masahif, many of the passages of the Quran that were sent down were known by those who died on the day of Yamama, but they were not known by those who survived them, nor were they written down, nor had Abu Bakr, Umar, or Uthman by that time collected the Quran, nor were they found with even one person after them. So, numerous Quran passages were lost because the only Muslims who had the passages memorized die in battle. If you're a Muslim and you're thinking to yourself, that's nonsense because hundreds of Muslims had the entire Quran memorized, congratulations. You mindlessly believed what your lying apologists told you. Your parents must be so proud of your extreme gullibility. Second, Abu Bakr and Zayd ibn Thabit thought it was a really strange idea to collect the Quran into a book. They had no concept of collecting the Quran into a book, but they decided that it's better than losing more of the Quran. Third, Zayd says that he knew it would be extremely difficult to collect the Quran. He says, by Allah, if he, Abu Bakr, had ordered me to shift one of the mountains from its place, it would not have been harder for me than what he ordered me concerning the collection of the Quran. But if Muslims today are correct and tons of early Muslims had the Quran memorized word for word, wouldn't it be pretty easy to make a manuscript of the Quran? I'm starting to notice that what Muslims today say about the Quran is totally different from what the early Muslims said about the Quran. Fourth, collecting the Quran was a messy process. Zayd says, "So I started to search for the Quranic material and to collect it from parchments, scapula, leaf stalks of date palms, and from the memories of men who knew it by heart." Now wait a minute. Shouldn't Zayd ibn Thabit know the Quran by heart? Why would he need parchments and scapula and leaf stalks and other people? Why? Because the modern Muslim narrative is complete nonsense. Fifth, contrary to today's narrative, Zayd admits that there were parts of the Quran that he could only find with a particular Muslim. He says, "I found with Khuzaymah 2 verses of Surat at-Tawbah which I had not found with anybody else." Here again, if so many Muslims had the Quran perfectly memorized, wouldn't Zayd have been able to find these verses with lots of Muslims? Wouldn't he know the verses himself? And yet he only found them with one man. Strange. But this isn't really the point of this video. We're about to see that Zayd's original Quran is not the same as today's Quran. Sahih al-Bukhari, 4987. Narrated Anas bin Malik, Hudhaifa bin al-Yaman came to Uthman at the time when the people of Sham and the people of Iraq were waging war to conquer Armenia and Azerbaijan. Hudhaifa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. So he said to Uthman, "O chief of the believers, save this nation before they differ about the book, the Quran, as Jews and the Christians did before them." So Uthman sent a message to Hafsa saying, "Send us the manuscript of the Quran so that we may compile the Quranic materials in perfect copies and return the manuscript to you." Hafsa sent it to Uthman. She sent Zayd's original Quran to Uthman. Uthman then ordered Zayd bin Thabit, Abdullah bin az-Zubair, Sa'id bin al-As, and Abdurrahman bin Harith bin Hisham to copy the original manuscript perfectly. Uthman said to the 3 Qurayshi men, "In case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh as the Quran was revealed in their tongue." They did so, and when they had written many copies, Uthman returned the original manuscripts to Hafsa. Uthman sent to every Muslim province 1 copy of what they had copied and ordered that all the other Quranic materials, whether written in fragmentary manuscripts or whole copies, be burnt. Notice 3 things here. First, Muslims were reciting different versions of the Quran. Hudhaifa was afraid of the people of Sham and Iraq, differences in the recitation of the Quran. That's strange, since there's only one Quran perfectly preserved since the time of Muhammad. Oh wait, even Sheikh Yasir Qadhi admits that Muslims were reciting different versions of the Quran with numerous errors.
People would simply copy with their own hands any copy that they had. And obviously human errors occurred. Obviously when you have 6th, 7th, 8th generation copyists, anybody at home who knows how to read and write is just copying the Quran, obviously errors are going to creep in, and there's no question that there were variances, spelling mistakes. In a society that's very Bedouin in nature, very illiterate by and large, the religion is coming in, educating the people, you're going to get a lot of variations, and people began noticing this is just not right.
Second, if you think these are only minor differences, read the passage. Hudhaifa says, "Save this nation before they differ about the book, the Quran, as Jews and the Christians did before them." There are major differences between Jews and Christians. Hudhaifa says that if Uthman doesn't intervene, Muslims will end up differing as much as Jews and Christians. Third, Zayd and co. aren't simply making a word-for-word copy of Zayd's earlier Quran, because Uthman admits that the team might have some disagreements. Uthman says, "In case you disagree with Zayd bin Thabit on any point in the Quran, then write it in the dialect of Quraysh as the Quran was revealed in their tongue." That's strange. I thought the Quran was revealed in 7 dialects. But Uthman says it was only revealed in 1. I'm beginning to think that Muslims today have no clue what they're talking about. It seems then that when Uthman ordered them to copy the original manuscript perfectly, he meant copy this, but try to make it perfect and not make an exact copy. If they were making exact copies, there wouldn't have been any room for disagreement. So Zayd and co. made several modified copies of Zayd's original Quran. But we know that there were even more significant differences between the original and the later copies. Sahih al-Bukhari, 4988. Zayd bin Thabit added, "A verse from Surat al-Ahzab was missed by me when we copied the Quran, and I used to hear Allah's Messenger reciting it. So we searched for it." They had to search for it? I thought they all knew it by heart. "So we searched for it and found it with Khuzaymah bin Thabit al-Ansari. That verse was, 'Among the believers are men who have been true in their covenant with Allah.'" Verse 33-23. Sahih al-Bukhari 4784. Narrated Zayd bin Thabit, "When we collected the fragmentary manuscripts of the Quran into copies, I missed one of the verses of Surat al-Ahzab which I used to hear Allah's Messenger reciting. Finally, I did not find it with anybody except Khuzaymah al-Ansari, whose witness was considered by Allah's Messenger equal to the witness of 2 men. And that verse was, 'Among the believers are men who have been true to their covenant with Allah.' 33-23. Notice, this was when Zayd and co. were making the copies, so this was during the caliphate of Uthman. Now, if they were simply copying Zayd's earlier version of the Quran, why were they using what Zayd called fragmentary manuscripts? Apparently, Zayd didn't think that any of the earlier manuscripts were complete. They were all fragmentary, including his. But here's what's interesting. Even though Zayd had his original version of the Quran, and even though he had numerous other manuscripts, he noticed that something was missing from all of them. He remembered a verse that he couldn't find anywhere. He went looking for it, and he eventually found it with Khuzaymah al-Ansari, the same Muslim who was the only Muslim who remembered the last 2 verses of Surah 9. Here again, I thought that there were hundreds of Muslims who had memorized the entire Quran word for word. And yet, there were verses that no one except Khuzaymah could remember. Putting all of this together, the early Muslim community didn't want to have the Quran in book form. They only reluctantly agreed to compile the Quran into a book because they recognized that human memory is a really, really bad way to preserve an entire book. If we go with the story in Kitab al-Masahif, much of the Quran was already lost. Muslims put together a physical copy because they didn't want to lose more of it. If we go with the watered-down story in Bukhari, we can still see that Muslim leaders were extremely worried that they would lose parts of the Quran unless they had a physical copy. What do Muslims tell us today? They tell us that the Quran couldn't be corrupted because of the infallible tool of human memory. What do the early Muslims tell us? They tell us, don't trust human memory. Get a hard copy. Muslims today also tell us that there has never been a single difference anywhere in any manuscript of the Quran. And yet, even Muslim scholars are admitting that the first generation of Muslims were making mistakes in their manuscripts.
People would simply copy with their own hands any copy that they had. And obviously human errors occurred. Obviously when you have 6th, 7th, 8th generation copyists, anybody at home who knows how to read and write is just copying the Quran, obviously errors are going to creep in, and there's no question that there were variances, spelling mistakes.
How could a Muslim make a mistake in writing the Quran when he was surrounded by Muslims who had memorized it perfectly? One of life's great mysteries. The early Muslim community ended up with so many differences in their Qurans that the Caliph Uthman had to standardize the text. Again, why did Uthman decide to standardize the text? Why was there a need for standardization? Because Muslims were reciting different Qurans. How were they reciting different Qurans when there's only been one Quran perfectly preserved from the time of Muhammad? Another of life's great mysteries. And as we've seen, the standardized version didn't agree with any earlier version, not even the earlier version of Zayd ibn Thabit himself. One man put the Quran together for two different caliphs, and he couldn't come up with the same Quran twice. Everything we read about the early history of the Quran tells us that there were massive problems putting this book together. It was an extraordinarily difficult and sloppy process. What do our Muslim friends tell us? Perfect preservation, right down to the letter. It's a miracle. Just ignore everything in all of our sources. Ignore the stories about Muhammad's top Quran reciters having different numbers of chapters. Ignore the stories about entire chapters coming up missing. Ignore the stories about large passages coming up missing. Ignore the stories about verses being eaten by a sheep. Ignore the stories about burning manuscripts to cover up the differences. Ignore the tens of thousands of differences among different Qurans today. Just ignore all the actual evidence and mindlessly believe one of the most demonstrably false claims in the history of humanity, the demonstrably, indisputably false claim that the Quran has been perfectly preserved. Oh, Muslims, you have no idea how happy you made us when you decided that the centerpiece of your case for Islam would be a claim that anyone can refute if they do 5 minutes of research. Please, tell us more about your perfectly preserved book. And while you're at it, explain one more thing. Zayd's original Quran didn't include Surah 33, verse 23. He only remembered that there was a Surah 33, verse 23 years later, and he was only able to find one man who could recite it. But there were many other problems with Surah 33. According to Ubay ibn Ka'b, one of Muhammad's top reciters of the Quran, more than 200 Quran verses were lost from Surah 33 alone. The verse of stoning and the verses about breastfeeding adults were also in Surah 33. These verses are no longer in there because Aisha had the only copy and her sheep conveniently ate it. So tell me, why did Surah 33 cause so many problems for the early Muslim community when there were supposedly so many Muslims who had memorized the entire Quran? If you don't know what I'm talking about right now, be sure to watch my video, 200 plus Quran verses missing from a single chapter. We need you to explain all of these problems with Surah 33 so that we don't continue thinking that there are holes in the narrative. You don't want us thinking that there are holes in the narrative, do you?